The thing that killed the most American soldiers in the Ardennes wasn't German artillery, it was physics. December 16th, 1944. The air didn't just freeze you in the Belgian forest. It found every gap in your wool uniform, every crack in your resolve, and pressed until you couldn't tell if you were shivering from the cold or the fear. 15 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that turned diesel fuel to syrup and made steel brittle as glass. But the cold wasn't the loudest thing in the valley that morning. That honor belonged to the 88. The sound of a German 88mm shell isn't a whistle like in the movies. It's a tearing sound like the sky itself is being ripped open by a giant angry zipper. Then comes the silence. A split second where every man in earshot offers up a prayer to whatever God he still believes in. Then the crump. The earth-shaking, teeth-rattling, bowel-loosening explosion that reminds you that physics doesn't care about your plans, your family back home, or whether you're a good man or a bad one. Sergeant Clifton Merrick didn't flinch anymore. Not after 4 years of this. He was currently on his back, sliding through mud that had the consistency of chocolate pudding mixed with ice shards, staring up at the oil-stained underbelly of a crippled GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck. The kind of truck that was supposed to be keeping the Third Army supplied and mobile. Right now it was keeping nobody nothing. Oil dripped onto his cheek, warm and viscous. The only warmth he'd felt in 6 hours. "Come on, you stubborn mule," Cliff muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air like smoke from a dying fire. His hands gripped a socket-wrench, knuckles raw and split open where the cold had found the cracks in his skin. "Just give me one more turn." The drive shaft on the GMC was cracked at the universal joint. A 3-inch U-bolt had sheared clean through, probably when the truck hit a shell crater at speed 2 days ago. Standard fix would take 20 minutes in a proper motor pool with proper parts. Out here, with improvised tools and fingers that barely worked, it was taking 2 hours. Another 88 shell landed. Closer this time. Dirt rained down on his boots. The truck chassis shuddered above him. For a moment, Cliff wondered if this was how it would end, crushed under a broken-down GMC while trying to fix somebody else's bad driving. "Merrick, get out from under there." The voice cut through the ringing in his ears. Sharp. Female. Command voice. Cliff slid out from beneath the truck, wiping grease from his face with a rag that was filthier than his skin. Standing over him, silhouetted against the grey December sky, was Lieutenant Rachel Hartley. In a world of grey steel and white snow and the brown mud of a European winter, Rachel was a spark of focused energy. 28 years old, Berkeley engineering degree and a commission in the Army Corps of Engineers that she wore like armor. She didn't look scared. She looked angry. And in December of 1944, anger was better fuel than gasoline. "They're dialing it in Sparky," she said, using the nickname the motor pool had given him. Not because he was quick-tempered, but because if something had an engine, Cliff Merrick could spark it back to life. "Colonel Blackburn wants us in the command tent. Now!" Cliff grabbed his helmet, shoving it over his wool cap. The metal was so cold it burned. "What's the old man want? I've got 3 trucks with blown gaskets, a half-track with a shattered tread, and exactly 0 replacement parts. I can't fix the war if I don't have—" "He wants to fix the war," Rachel interrupted, already turning to walk briskly toward the tree line. "Or at least the part that's been killing us for 6 weeks straight." They walked past the graveyard. That's what the men called it. The vehicle graveyard. Sherman tanks with their turrets blown clean off the metal, peeled back like a sardine can opened by an angry giant. Jeeps burned down to their skeletons. Trucks with their cabs crushed, their cargo beds twisted into abstract sculptures of American defeat. All of them victims of the same executioner, the Wolf's Den. Up on the ridge, looming over the valley like the eye of some ancient malevolent god, sat the concrete fortress that Wehrmacht Major Friedrich Krauss commanded. A masterpiece of German engineering dug into the granite cliff face like a tick burrowed into skin. Unreachable, untouchable, and absolutely devastatingly lethal. Krauss had an 88mm flak 1836 cannon up there, the kind of gun that was designed to shoot down aircraft at 20,000 feet. Krauss used it to pick off American vehicles at 2,000 yards. And at 2,000 yards, that gun could punch through 4.5 inches of armor like it was tissue paper. Right now, the United States Army was the tissue paper. The command tent smelled like cigarette smoke, wet wool, and desperation. Heat hit Cliff like a physical blow when he ducked through the canvas flap. A potbelly stove in the corner was cranked so hot the metal glowed dull red. Cigarette smoke hung in layers, swirling around the map table where Colonel Wade Blackburn stood staring at a topographical chart like he wanted to strangle it with his bare hands. "Merrick, Hartley, get over here." Colonel Wade Blackburn was 50 years old, Texas-born, cavalry-trained, and currently commanding an armored division that couldn't advance 50 yards without getting cut to pieces. His voice sounded like gravel being mixed in a cement truck, the kind of voice that didn't need to yell to make you listen. Cliff stepped forward, snapping a salute that Blackburn waved away with the impatience of a man who'd been saluted 10,000 times too many. The colonel's thick finger jabbed at the map, right at the red circle marking Wolf's Den. "We're stuck," Blackburn said flatly. "No preamble, no sugarcoating. Kraus has us pinned like butterflies in a collection case. Every time I send armor up that valley, he turns them into scrap metal before they get within 1,000 yards. We can't get air support because of this damned fog, and Washington is screaming for a breakthrough." He looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. The eyes of a man who'd been sending boys to die and getting nothing for it but casualty reports and questions from generals who weren't standing in the cold. But intelligence just dropped a present in our laps. Blackburn motioned to a wooden crate in the corner of the tent. Cliff walked over curious despite himself. Inside wasn't rations, wasn't ammunition. It was a wooden model maybe 2 feet long, painted olive drab. A rocket. T-34 Calliope variant, Blackburn explained. Experimental heavy payload, designed specifically to punch through reinforced concrete. 600 pounds of high explosive in a package that'll fly 400 yards and turn anything it hits into rubble. One good hit from this beauty and Krause's bunker becomes his tomb. Cliff looked at the model, then back at the colonel. "So we shoot it from down here?" "No." Blackburn slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups jump. "That's the problem, Sergeant. The range is too short from any position down here in the valley. The angle's wrong. The concrete's too thick. We need to fire this thing from the Viper's Ledge." He tapped another spot on the map. A small notation reading Viper's Ledge marked a rock outcropping on the mountainside maybe 200 yards from Wolf's Den. "That ledge is the only blind spot Krause has," Blackburn continued. "His 88 can't depress low enough to hit it. It's perfect. Except for one small problem." Cliff was already looking at the map, his mechanic's mind running calculations. The Viper's Ledge was accessed only by something the map labelled Snake Path. A goat trail, narrow, winding, steep enough that the contour lines on the map were practically touching each other. "Sir," Cliff started, his voice careful, "you can't get a launcher up there. A 1.5 truck is 87 inches wide. That path, if it's anything like what the map shows, can't be more than 4 feet across. The truck won't fit. It'll slide right off the cliff." "Correct," Blackburn said. "And a Sherman tank," Cliff continued. 34 tons, Blackburn interrupted. "The trail can't support more than 8 tons without crumbling. We know. We had engineers assess it." Cliff looked at Rachel. She nodded confirmation, her face grim. "So," Cliff said slowly, "you have the most powerful anti-bunker rocket in the European theatre, and you have no way to deliver it." "Unless one of you geniuses has a better idea," Blackburn said, his voice heavy with defeat. "I'm going to have to order a frontal assault at dawn, which means a lot of boys aren't going home to their families. 60% casualties is the estimate. That's 400 men, Merrick. 400 sons and brothers and fathers who'll die trying to take a position we could crack with one shot, if only we could get that shot to the right spot." The tent fell silent. Outside, the distant thud of artillery continued its steady percussion. The soundtrack to the war. Men were dying out there right now. More would die tomorrow. The math was simple and brutal. Cliff thought about the letter in his pocket. Not really a letter. A drawing. Crayon on paper, the edges already curling from moisture. His daughter Lily had drawn it 3 months ago, just before he shipped out. A stick-figure house. A yellow sun. The words, "Daddy, come home," in letters that wandered drunkenly across the top of the page because 5-year-olds haven't quite mastered straight lines yet. He thought about the boys outside shivering in foxholes, writing their own letters home that might never get mailed. He looked at the rocket model in its crate. Then he looked through the tent flap at his own vehicle parked outside. A standard-issue Willys MB Jeep. Battered, dented, covered in mud and scratched to hell. But small, agile, light enough that 2 men could push it if they had to. "Sir," Cliff said softly. Blackburn looked up. "You got something to say, Sergeant?" Cliff walked over to the map. He traced the narrow winding snake path with his grease-stained finger. A finger that had rebuilt tractors in Ohio since he was 12 years old. A finger that understood how things worked, how they broke, and how to make them work again when the manual said they couldn't. "You said a truck is too wide and a tank is too heavy." "That's right." Cliff turned to look at the colonel, and in his eyes was something dangerous. The kind of dangerous that mechanics get when they see a problem that everybody says can't be solved. "Then we don't use a truck," Cliff said. "And we don't use a tank." He paused. "We build a mule." Blackburn frowned. "A mule?" I can get that rocket up there, Colonel, Cliff said, his voice steady as bedrock. But I'm going to need my wrench. I'm going to need Lieutenant Hartley's brain. And I'm going to need permission to destroy a perfectly good jeep. Rachel was already looking at him, her eyes widening as she understood what he was proposing. You want to modify a jeep to carry a 600-pound rocket up a mountain trail, she said slowly. Not modify, Cliff corrected. Transform, strip it down, rebuild it, make it into something it was never designed to be. Blackburn studied him for a long moment. You're talking about violating every regulation in the Army manual. Yes, sir. You're talking about field modifications that could get you court-martialed if they fail. Yes, sir. And if this works, Cliff thought about Lily's drawing, about the yellow sun she'd drawn in a world that was currently nothing but grey. If it works, sir, those 400 boys get to go home. The colonel was quiet. Then he reached into his desk and pulled out a flask. Tennessee whiskey. He took a drink, then offered it to Cliff. Physics doesn't negotiate, Merrick. No, sir, it doesn't. And gravity doesn't take bribes. No, sir. Blackburn took another drink. How long do you need? Cliff looked at Rachel. She was already doing math in her head, her fingers twitching like she was writing equations in the air. 12 hours, she said. Maybe less if we're lucky. You've got 8, Blackburn said. Dawn is when Krauss is most alert. We launch the feint attack at 0500. You need to be in position by 0430. He looked at them both. This is the longest of long shots. You understand that? Sir, Cliff said, long shots are all we've got left. Blackburn nodded once. Then get to work. And Merrick. Yes, sir. Bring my boys home. The vehicle graveyard looked different now. Not like a cemetery, like a parts depot. Rachel stood next to Cliff, both of them surveying the wreckage with new eyes. What had been twisted metal and defeat an hour ago was now opportunity. Raw materials. The bones they'd used to build their monster. We need the rear axle from that GMC 6x6, Cliff said, pointing to a charred truck skeleton in the snow. The truck had hit a mine 2 days ago. The cab was destroyed, but the rear tandem axle assembly was intact. And we need the engine from that Dodge weapons carrier. Rachel was already walking toward the Dodge WC-63. It had caught fire when a fuel line ruptured, but the engine, a big inline-6 T214, was still good. 92 horsepower compared to the Jeep's 60. More torque than a standard Willys could ever handle. The engine won't fit, Rachel said, running her hand along the Dodge's hood. The block is 6 inches too long for the Jeep's frame. The mounting points are completely different. Then we make it fit, Cliff said. He was already grabbing his welding gear from the motor pool tent. If it doesn't fit, we cut until it does. What followed was 12 hours of work that would make engineers weep and mechanics nod with grim understanding. They didn't modify the Jeep. They violated it. First, they ripped out the stock Willys Go Devil 4-cylinder engine. 60 horsepower. Reliable. Good enough for scouting and courier runs. Completely inadequate for hauling 600 pounds of rocket up a mountain trail at a 18% grade. The Dodge engine came out of its frame with a cutting torch, 40 minutes of sparks and swearing, and the acrid smell of burning metal. 680 pounds of cast iron and steel. A lion's heart for a vehicle that was built to be a house cat. Cliff and Rachel manhandled it into position. It took 4 soldiers to lift it, all of them grunting with effort, their breath steaming in the cold. The engine didn't fit, just like Rachel said. So Cliff did what mechanics have been doing since the first wheel got stuck in the first ditch. He improvised. He cut a 6-inch hole through the Jeep's hood, just hacked it out with tin snips and a hacksaw, the metal screaming in protest. The air cleaner housing poked through the hole like a periscope. Regulations said you couldn't do that. Physics said you could. Cliff chose physics. The real magic happened at the rear. Rachel and Cliff dragged the massive dual-wheel tandem axle from the GMC truck through the mud. 340 pounds of solid steel complete with leaf springs and differential housing. It took 6 men to position it. We need to extend the frame, Rachel said, her engineering brain working through the problem. The rocket's center of gravity will be too far back. We'll have a leverage problem. Simple physics. Long lever, heavy weight, light front end equals tipping backward. She sketched in the dirt with a stick drawing force diagrams that would have made her Berkeley professors proud. Archimedes' principle, she continued. Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I can move the world. Our problem is that our lever is working against us. We need to change the fulcrum point. How long? Cliff asked. Rachel did calculations in her head. Extend the frame from 80 inches to 112 inches. Move the rocket's center of gravity 18 inches forward of the rear axle. That changes our leverage ratio from 3 to 1 to 1.8 to 1. Front wheels stay on the ground. Then that's what we do. They scavenged steel channel beams from German anti-tank obstacles. 2x4-inch I-beams that the Wehrmacht had welded together to block roads. Now those same beams would carry an American rocket to a German bunker. The welding took hours. Cliff's arms ached from holding the torch steady. The blue-white light was so bright it left purple afterimages even through the welding mask. The air tasted like ozone and burning flux. His hands, already raw from the cold, blistered from the heat. But slowly, impossibly, the Grizzly took shape. When they bolted the dual rear wheels onto the extended frame, the Jeep didn't look like a Jeep anymore. It looked like something that had crawled out of a fever dream. 6 wheels, 2 in front, 4 in back, arranged in a tandem configuration. The rear tires, wrapped in heavy chains, scavenged from a destroyed half-track. It sat low and wide, crouching like a steel beetle ready to climb. Rachel fabricated the launch rail from angle iron, calculating the 35-degree elevation angle that would send the rocket into Wolf's Den's observation slit. The rail looked crude, ugly, welded with beads that wouldn't pass any inspection. But it was strong, and strong was all that mattered. Sergeant Vincent Kowalski watched them work. 40 years old, Brooklyn-born, 6 years in the army driving trucks. He represented every by-the-book soldier who'd ever looked at a field modification and seen only disaster waiting to happen. "Morrison," he said, using Cliff's last name the way sergeants do when they're not quite friends but not quite enemies. "You're wasting parts we need for real vehicles. Colonel, with respect, this is insanity." Blackburn was there watching, torn between hope and procedure, between the boys who needed supplies and the boys who would die at dawn. "How much longer, Merrick?" the colonel asked. 2 hours, sir." Blackburn looked at Kowalski. "Then we wait 2 hours, Sergeant. Dismissed." When Kowalski left, Cliff leaned against the Grizzly's hood. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From exhaustion. From 4 years of war and 6 weeks of watching good men die for yards of frozen mud. Rachel sat down next to him close enough that their shoulders touched. Not romance. Just the human need for contact when the world is trying its best to kill you. "What made you think of this?" she asked quietly. Cliff pulled out Lily's drawing. The paper was soft from being handled, the crayon colors starting to smudge. "She drew a sun," he said. "Yellow crayon. Like the world is still bright somewhere. Like there's still warmth if you know where to look." He carefully refolded the paper. "I need to get back to that world, Rachel. I need to be the man she thinks I am. The man who fixes things." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her own pocket and pulled out a photograph. A young man in a tanker's uniform grinning at the camera. Her brother, Tommy. Lieutenant Thomas Hartley. Killed 3 months ago when his Sherman took an 88 shell right through the turret. Same valley, same fortress, same physics that didn't care about courage or training or how much your family loved you. "Tommy tried to assault Wolf's Den head-on," she said. "Followed orders. Did everything by the book. And he died. Because the book doesn't account for an 88mm cannon that can shoot through 4 inches of armor like it's butter." She put the photograph away. "I'm not here to mourn him, Cliff. I'm here to make sure his death teaches us something. That sometimes the book is wrong. That sometimes you have to build something the book says can't exist." They sat in silence. 2 people who understood that grief isn't about crying. It's about taking all that pain and turning it into something useful. Something that might save the next person from experiencing the same loss. Finally, Cliff stood. "Let's finish this." The final hours blurred together. Torque wrenches, bolt patterns, fuel line routing, electrical connections for the rocket's ignition system. 100 small problems, each one solved with improvisation and profanity and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that built America in the first place. When the sun started to think about rising, they were ready. The Grizzly sat in the motor pool looking like nothing else in the United States Army inventory. Ugly, scarred with weld marks that looked like surgical stitches on a wound. The extended frame made it too long. The dual rear wheels made it too wide. The oversized engine made it too loud. It was perfect. Cliff climbed into the driver's seat. The seat he'd sat in 1,000 times, now positioned over an engine that growled instead of purred. He put his hand on the key and looked at Rachel. "Here's hoping physics is on our side," he said. He turned the key. The Dodge engine didn't start gently. It exploded to life with a roar that shook tools off the workbench. 8,000 RPM redline. The whole vehicle vibrated like it was trying to tear itself apart. The exhaust note was so loud that soldiers 50 yards away looked up in alarm. It sounded angry. It sounded dangerous. It sounded ready. The tent flap opened. Colonel Blackburn stepped in, followed by a dozen soldiers who'd heard the noise and come to see what fresh hell the motor pool had created. They stared. Blackburn walked around the Grizzly, slowly taking in every modification, every welded seam, every chain-wrapped tire. He reached out and touched the launch rail, testing its strength. "God help us all," he whispered. Then louder, "What do you call this thing, Merrick?" Cliff gripped the steering wheel, felt the power thrumming under his hands, felt the potential energy waiting to be unleashed, thought about Lily's yellow sun and Tommy Hartley's sacrifice and 400 boys who didn't know they might live to see tomorrow. "I call it the Grizzly, sir," he said, his voice carrying over the engine's growl, "and it's time to go hunting." But then Sergeant Kowalski stepped forward. "With respect, Colonel, we should test this thing before we send them up that mountain." Blackburn nodded. "Agreed. Merrick, take her around the compound. Let's see if she holds together." Cliff shifted into first gear. The clutch was heavier than he expected, the extra weight of the rocket and the reinforced frame making everything more difficult. He eased out the clutch and felt the Grizzly lurch forward. For 50 feet it was beautiful. Then physics came calling. The Grizzly had power. It had traction. What it didn't have was enough weight in the front to keep the nose down. The 600-pound rocket mounted on the extended frame created a lever arm that wanted to lift the front wheels off the ground. Simple torque calculation. Force times distance equals rotational moment. At 15 miles per hour, the front wheels lifted 8 inches off the ground. Cliff felt it happening and tried to correct, but it was too late. The whole vehicle tipped backward. Rachel, riding in the passenger seat, threw herself clear. Cliff rode it down, his hands locked on the wheel as the Grizzly settled back with a crunch that bent the frame and cracked the steering column. Silence. Then Kowalski's voice, weary but not surprised. "I told you so." Cliff climbed out, looking at the damage. The front suspension was tweaked. Oil was leaking from somewhere. All that work, and they'd just proven that physics wins every argument. Rachel walked over, her face pale but determined. "The center of gravity is still too far back. We didn't extend the frame enough, or we need more weight forward." Cliff felt defeat settling on his shoulders like the cold. They were out of time. Dawn was 4 hours away. "Morrison." He looked up. Kowalski was walking toward him. The sergeant reached out and put a hand on Cliff's shoulder. "I was wrong," Kowalski said quietly. "You're not wasting parts. You're trying to save lives. And I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner." He looked at the Grizzly. "What do you need to fix it?" Rachel's mind was already racing. "Counterweight. We need to move weight forward. The battery, the toolbox, spare ammunition, anything we can mount on the front bumper." For the next hour, they worked with a new urgency. Cliff welded an external rack to the front bumper. They moved the 12-volt battery forward, 56 pounds, added a toolbox full of wrenches and spare parts, 34 pounds, strapped spare Thompson ammunition cans to the rack, 80 pounds, 170 pounds total, positioned as far forward as physics would allow. Rachel did the math again. The center of gravity just shifted 22 inches forward. New ratio is 1.4 to 1. Front axle load is now positive 85 pounds instead of negative 140. It should work. Should. The most dangerous word in engineering. Cliff climbed back in, turned the key. The engine roared to life again, sounding like a wounded bear challenging a wolf to single combat. He put it in gear, eased out the clutch. The Grizzly moved forward, 10 feet, 20, 30. The front wheels stayed on the ground. Cliff accelerated, 15 miles per hour, 20. The nose stayed down. The steering was heavy, the whole vehicle handling like a drunk elephant trying to ice skate, but it worked. He brought it back around to where the others waited, shut down the engine, looked at Rachel. "She corners like a drunk elephant," he said, "but she corners." Rachel was grinning, actually grinning for the first time in 3 months. Blackburn stepped forward. The colonel's face was unreadable. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out his flask. "Tennessee whiskey," he said, offering it to Cliff, "for when you plant the flag on Krause's grave." Cliff took a drink. It burned all the way down, warming him from the inside for the first time in weeks. Soldiers were gathering now. Word had spread. They stood in a loose semicircle, watching these two crazy people who'd just welded together a machine that shouldn't exist to accomplish a mission that couldn't succeed. Kowalski approached, stood at attention, saluted. "Merrick," he said formally, "I was wrong. About you. About this." He dropped the salute. "Bring her back, Sparky. And when you do first rounds on me." Cliff carefully taped Lily's drawing to the dashboard, the yellow sun bright against the grey steel. A promise. A talisman. A reminder that somewhere in the world, a little girl thought her daddy could fix anything. Rachel climbed into the passenger seat. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. They both understood what came next. The soldiers lined up on both sides of the grizzly. Silent. Respectful. Some of them praying. All of them knowing that if this worked, they wouldn't have to make a dawn assault. If it failed, 400 of them would be dead by noon. Cliff started the engine one more time. That magnificent, terrifying roar. Blackburn leaned in through the driver's window. "You know the math is razor thin," he said quietly. "You're off by 2 inches anywhere on that trail, and you're both dead." Cliff looked at the colonel. "Sir, I've been doing math my whole life. Leverage ratios, gear reductions, torque curves. The math says this should work." "Should. Should is all we've ever had, Colonel. Should is what got us across the Atlantic. Should is what put us in France. Should is what's going to put us at Krause's door with 600 pounds of hell in our pocket." Blackburn stepped back, raised his hand in salute. Every soldier in that motor pool saluted. Cliff put the Grizzly in gear and drove into the darkness, heading for a mountain trail that was never meant for vehicles carrying a rocket, that was never meant to be mobile, following a plan that was never meant to work. Behind them, Colonel Blackburn watched until the taillights disappeared. "God help them," he said to no one in particular, "because physics sure as hell won't." But he was wrong about that. Physics doesn't help. Physics doesn't hurt. Physics just is. Immutable. Unforgiving. Utterly neutral. And sometimes, if you understand the equations well enough, if you're stubborn enough to solve for variables that everyone says can't be solved, physics becomes the most reliable ally you'll ever have. The Grizzly's engine growled into the darkness, carrying 2 mechanics and a dream, and the hope that sometimes, just sometimes, American ingenuity can move mountains. One bolt at a time. The blizzard was both blessing and curse. Cliff kept the Grizzly in second gear, wrestling the wheel as 40-mile-per-hour winds tried to shove them sideways. Visibility 15 feet. Speed 8 miles per hour. The Dodge engine strained against the governor, wanting to run, but speed was a luxury they couldn't afford. Not on ice. Not with 600 pounds of high explosives strapped to their backs. The dashboard thermometer read -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Rachel checked the map, her breath fogging despite the minimal heat bleeding off the engine. 2 miles to Snake Path trailhead. We're making good time. Good time. Relative term. 3 miles in 40 minutes. The feint attack would begin in 4 hours. They needed position in 3.5. The radio crackled. Colonel Blackburn's voice cutting through static. "Grizzly 1, this is Bull 6. Sit rep over." Rachel grabbed the handset. "Bull 6, Grizzly 1. 2 miles from Objective Alpha. Weather providing concealment. Over." "Copy. Storm breaks in 4 hours. You'll lose cover right when you need it most. Over." 4 hours. Right when they'd be exposed on the mountainside. When Major Krause's 88mm cannon would have clean sight lines. "Understood, Bull 6. We'll make it work. Over." "That's what I like to hear. Bull 6, out." They drove in silence. The forest pressed close pine trees, heavy with snow, creating a tunnel that felt like driving through a throat. The Grizzly's chains bit ice with steady rhythm. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Almost hypnotic. Then Cliff saw the structure. "Contact left," he said quietly, slowing. "An abandoned German observation post. Concrete. Small. Vision slits facing the valley." "Stop here," Rachel said. "I want to check it." "We don't have time." "Intelligence is never wasted, Cliff. Stop." He brought the Grizzly to a halt. Rachel jumped out, Thompson in hand, moving with practiced caution. She disappeared inside the post. Cliff waited, hands on wheel eyes, scanning tree lines. Every shadow could hide a German patrol. Rachel emerged, running. "Go," she said, climbing in. "Drive, now." Cliff shifted into gear without questions. The Grizzly lurched forward. "What did you find?" Rachel held a piece of paper, frozen, stiff, a dispatch from a dead radio operator's hand. She read aloud, translating from German. "Intelligence confirms American superweapon. Mobile rocket launcher estimated 600 kilograms. Increase all mountain patrols. Major Krause orders destroy transport at any cost." Cliff felt his stomach drop. They know. They know. The blizzard suddenly felt less like concealment, more like temporary reprieve. The moment weather cleared, they'd be exposed, targeted, vulnerable to that 88mm cannon that had been killing American vehicles with surgical precision for 6 weeks. "Doesn't change the math," Cliff said finally. "We're still the only vehicle that can make the climb. Still the only shot those boys have. Rachel looked at him, her face half shadow, half determination. Tommy said something the night before his last mission. If the equation's right, you solve it, even if the teacher says it's impossible. Cliff squeezed her shoulder briefly, then focused back on the road. 30 minutes later, the engine coughed. Once, twice, power dropped. The Grizzly slowed. No, Cliff whispered. Not now. He pulled over, barely room to stop without blocking the path. Killed the engine. The silence was deafening. Transmission, he said, climbing out. Has to be. The cold hit like a fist. -18 felt different standing still. It found every gap, every exposed inch of skin pressed until lungs ached. He slid underneath with flashlight in teeth. The undercarriage was coated in ice. There, the transmission pan. Ice crystals had formed inside. The lubricant, rated to -15 degrees, had turned to slush. Rachel, I need heat. Blowtorch, now. She crawled under with him, torch igniting with a whoosh that sounded too loud. They were violating every safety protocol, working under a vehicle with open flame. If a fuel line leaked, they'd both burn. But the alternative was staying here until they froze, or a German patrol found them. The torch heated the pan. Slowly. The ice crystals melted. Lubricant began flowing. Then voices. German voices. 200 yards away. Moving through forest. Cliff put his hand over Rachel's mouth, pointed. She nodded. Killed the torch. They lay under the Grizzly, barely breathing as the patrol passed close enough to hear individual words. Amerikanische Fahrzeug. American vehicle. They were hunting specifically for the Grizzly. The patrol moved on. Voices faded. 5 more minutes, then Rachel reignited the torch. 10 minutes of careful heating. Cliff hand-cycled the gears, feeling resistance ease. That's all we can do, he whispered. Maybe 2 hours before it happens again. They crawled out, climbed back in. The engine fired first try. Transmission engaged. Rough. Grinding, but engaged. They drove. 15 minutes brought them to Snake Path trailhead. Cliff stopped and stared. The map had lied. What stretched before them was barely a goat path. 42 inches wide. The Grizzly with dual rear wheels was 48 inches. 6 inches difference. 3 inches clearance each side. And it went up. 18% grade. Switchbacks like question marks. No guardrails. Just granite left and 1,000-foot drop right. Rachel pulled out her slide rule. Math says it's possible. 3 inches clearance if we stay centered. Chains give traction. 6-wheel drive distributes weight. It should work. Should. That word again. Cliff looked at Lily's drawing on the dashboard. The yellow sun. Should is all we need, he said, shifting into first. The climb began. Immediately he understood why no one drove Snake Path. Steering required constant correction. Granite wall threatening left. Void pulling right. He didn't look down. Looking was death. Chains bit ice and stone like 1,000 tiny hammers. Engine growled, first gear barely sufficient. Every rock, every irregularity transmitted through the wheel to his hands. Rachel called distances. First switchback in 100 yards, eroded section reported. 5 minutes of constant tension, muscles locked, barely breathing. The switchback appeared suddenly. Cliff slammed brakes. The Grizzly slid 6 inches before chains caught. They stopped with front bumper over empty space. Back up, Rachel said, voice tight. Need more room. He reversed 10 feet, studied the turn. The hairpin was nearly 180 degrees. Path narrowed to 38 inches at apex, and the eroded section a 3-foot gap where the path had collapsed. We can't make it, Rachel said. Middle axle will drop into that gap. We'll high center or tip. Cliff did math in his head. Wheelbase 112 inches. Gap 36 inches. The gap sat almost exactly at middle axle position. Crawl across slowly and weight would settle on the gap's edge. Stone would crumble. They'd slide backward into void, but with momentum. Archimedes proved you can move the world with a long enough lever, Cliff said, staring at the gap. Right now, momentum is our lever. Gravity is our fulcrum. And if we're brave enough to trust the equation won't let us down. He looked at her. I need you to trust the math, Rachel. Not hope, not luck. Math. Pure, simple, unforgiving math that says we can make it. Rachel was silent, then gripped the dashboard. Tommy would have loved this. The crazy, impossible, shouldn't work math of it. She looked at Cliff. Do it. He backed up another 20 feet, shifted to second, looked at the gap, the switchback, the narrow thread of stone that was supposed to hold 3 tons of steel and hope. Then he thought about Lily's yellow sun and pressed the accelerator. The Grizzly surged forward, 22 miles per hour. Reckless. The only speed that would give them enough momentum. Front wheels hit the switchback. Cliff turned hard left. The vehicle leaned. Gravity pulled toward the void. Front wheels cleared the gap. For 0.8 of a second, Airborne and Cliff could see valley floor spinning 1,000 feet below Rachel's window. Then, middle tandem axle slammed down onto the gap's edge. The world tilted. Physics grabbed them with iron fist, pulling sideways toward the drop, toward darkness, toward the end. 3 tons of steel, 600 pounds of rocket, 2 people who'd welded together something that shouldn't exist, all tipping. Slowly, inevitably. Angular momentum, taking over center of gravity, passing point of no return. Rachel screamed. Cliff held the wheel and thought about yellow crayon suns. Then the rear dual wheels caught solid ground. Not smooth, not level, but ground. Granite that hadn't eroded. All 4 rear tires, wrapped in chains, bit into granite with 800 pounds of downforce and 680 foot-pounds of torque distributed across 6-wheel drive. The differential locked. Chains dug in. Tires clawed. The Grizzly stopped tipping. For a moment they hung there, balanced between salvation and oblivion. Cliff could feel the exact instant when physics decided which way the equation would resolve. Then the rear wheels pulled. Dragged. Fought gravity with stubborn mechanical advantage of steel and rubber and American engineering that refused to accept defeat. The belly scraped across jagged rock, metal screaming, sparks showering into darkness, frame groaning, suspension compressing, but it held. Inch by inch they dragged themselves across and back onto solid path. The vehicle slammed down onto all 6 wheels with a crash that rattled Cliff's teeth. They were across. Cliff stopped, hands shaking. Rachel gasped for air, face white. Never, she said. Never. Again. Cliff looked at her, started laughing. Couldn't stop. The kind of laugh that comes when your body realizes it's alive. Rachel started laughing too. Both of them sitting in a modified Jeep halfway up a mountain in a blizzard, laughing because they'd bet their lives on physics and won. When laughter subsided, Cliff checked damage. Oil leaking from belly pan. He stuffed a rag in, wired it with coat hanger. Field expedient. Wouldn't last long. Didn't need to. They drove. 40 minutes later, they saw Wolf's Den. The blizzard was thinning. Through swirling snow, the fortress. Concrete and granite built into cliff face. Observation slit glowing yellow. The 88mm barrel protruding, angled upward, unable to depress low enough to target their position. The blind spot. Viper's Ledge, 50 yards from Wolf's Den. Then the searchlight activated. White beam, piercing, thinning blizzard, sweeping mountainside. Hunting. Rachel timed it. 47 seconds per rotation. 90 seconds before that beam sweeps our position, she said. Cliff looked at remaining distance. 40 yards. Can't make it in 90 seconds, not at this speed. 70 seconds. Cliff made a decision. Killed the engine. Sudden silence was profound. No roar, no rattle, just wind and searchlight's mechanical whir. "What are you doing?" Rachel whispered. "Coasting. If engine's off, we're quieter." He released brake. The Grizzly rolled forward, pulled by gravity. Chains made soft, crunching sounds. Soft. But in silence, every sound felt like thunder. 30 yards. 25. Searchlight swinging toward them. Rachel counted down. 20 seconds. 15. 20 yards. 15. 10 seconds. 10 yards. Cliff rolled into shadow of rock outcropping just as the beam passed overhead. Light illuminated where they'd been 2 seconds ago, missed by inches. They sat in darkness, not breathing, as beam continued and moved away. 2 seconds, Rachel breathed. We made it by 2 seconds. They were in position. Viper's Ledge, 50 yards from Wolf's Den, hidden in the blind spot Krause's cannon couldn't reach. Now came the hard part. Rachel pulled out electrical testing equipment. Firing system was straightforward. 12-volt battery, ignition relay, nichrome wire that would heat to combustion when current flowed. She checked continuity. 11.8 volts. Green across all connections. Cliff whispered calculations. Horizontal 52 yards, vertical 18 feet. Rail at 35 degrees. Trajectory puts rocket right through observation slit. He recalculated. Rocket center of gravity 28 inches aft of rail mount. Recoil force 4,800 pounds. Frame stress right at tolerance edge. It'll hold. Probably. Probably, Rachel echoed. She pulled out Tommy's photograph, looked at it in red lens flashlight. Tommy's tank didn't have a chance, she said softly.
Regulations. Procedure. Following orders into firing solution that couldn't work. He died because the book said that was how you assault fortified positions. She put photograph away, looked at Cliff. This crazy improvised shouldn't exist machine. This is Tommy's real memorial. Proof the book is sometimes wrong. That sometimes you need a mechanic who refuses to accept impossible. Cliff pulled off his glove, touched Lily's drawing on dashboard. She drew sunshine in a world that's all grey. That's what kids do. See what should be, not what is. He looked at Rachel. We're about to bring sunshine to this mountain. 600 pounds of it. Fast as lightning. Hot as the sun. Rachel smiled. Not happy. The smile of someone who's made peace with whatever comes next. Theory meets practice. Engineer and mechanic. Cliff agreed. He reached for ignition toggle when Rachel grabbed his arm. Wait. Hear that? A voice. German. Close. A door on Wolf's Den groaned open. Wehrmacht officer stepped onto maintenance gantry, cigarette in hand, probably Lieutenant Hans Becker taking a smoke break. He looked down, saw tire tracks, fresh tracks leading right to where Grizzly sat in shadow. For a moment he stared confused. A vehicle. Here, impossible. Then he saw the white star on the door. Americana! He screamed, dropping cigarette. Alarm, alarm! Siren inside Wolf's Den began wailing. Hand-cranked air raid siren, 440 hertz, audible 2 miles. Every German soldier within 5 minutes now knew Americans were at their doorstep. The quiet mission had become a race against time. Go! Rachel shouted. Cover me! She rolled out passenger side. Thompson leveled across hood opening fire. Heavy 45 caliber rounds sparked against concrete railing, forcing Becker to duck. Cliff scrambled to back of vehicle, hands shaking, not from cold, from adrenaline. From knowing they had maybe 30 seconds before German machine guns turned their position into kill zone. He reached for ignition toggle, flipped it. Nothing. No ignition. No spark. No launch. Just hollow mocking click that meant failure. Cliff! Rachel screamed, changing magazines. Fix it! I can't hold them forever. Above MG-42 barrel being positioned. 1,200 rounds per minute. Hitler's zipper would tear through Grizzly's armor like tissue. Cliff traced wiring with shaking hands. Found the problem. Insulation cracked. Cold brittleness. Rubber rated to -10. They were at -18. 8 degrees difference. Molecular structure had failed. Not sabotage, just physics being physics. Manual ignition required. Touching bare wires together while standing 10 feet from rocket motor whose backblast would reach 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Lethal radius 12 feet. Cliff stood at 10. 2 feet between him and survival. 2 feet, physics said, didn't exist. Rachel fired another burst. They're bringing up machine gun, Cliff. Whatever you're doing, do it now. Cliff pulled combat knife. Slashed insulation, exposing copper. 2 wires. Touch them together, circuit completes. Nichrome heats. Rocket ignites. Everything within 12 feet gets incinerated. He looked at Fortress. At observation slit dealing death for 6 weeks. At gun that killed Tommy Hartley and 22 other tank crews. He looked at Lily's drawing. Yellow sun. Promised to come home. Then at Rachel, and she looked back. No words. Just a nod. Get down! Cliff roared. Rachel threw herself behind front wheel. Cliff jammed the wires together. There was no gentle click. There was the sound of the world ending. The flash wasn't white. It was beyond white. The color of creation itself, the moment when physics stops being theory and becomes raw violence. Cliff saw it for a tenth of a second before his eyes slammed shut. Saw the exhaust nozzle transform from cold steel into a sun being born. 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit erupting in a space never designed to have a human 10 feet away. Then the shockwave hit. Not sound. Sound came later. This was pure kinetic energy, a wall of expanding gas moving at 2,100 feet per second, picking him up and throwing him backward into a snowbank hard enough to drive air from his lungs. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see. His ears screamed a single sustained note in C-sharp. His face felt sunburned eyebrows singed away, copper in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue. But he was alive. And as he lay there gasping, watching purple after-images dance, he saw the most beautiful thing he'd ever witnessed. The rocket left the rail. Not flying. Punching. A fist of fire and fury driving through air with conscious purpose. The exhaust trail was white-hot plasma that lit the entire mountainside, turning night into day for exactly 1.4 seconds, 200 yards.
The rocket covered it in less time than it took Cliff's brain to register what his eyes were seeing. It slammed into Wolf's den's observation slit with a sound like a cathedral bell struck by a sledgehammer. Armored glass shattered. The rocket disappeared into the fortress, burying itself deep in concrete. Then nothing. 1 second. Silence. Just wind and ringing in Cliff's ears and his ragged breathing. He pushed up on his elbows, squinting through spots. 2 seconds. Still nothing. No explosion. No fire. Rachel was stirring, pushing snow off her back. 3 seconds. Cliff! Rachel's voice, thin and scared. Why isn't it? 4 seconds. Understanding crashed over him like ice water. It's a dud. 600 pounds of explosive that travelled 200 yards and failed to detonate. All of this. The building, the climbing, Tommy's sacrifice, Lily's drawing, 400 boys waiting to die at dawn, 5 seconds, all for nothing. Cliff's mind spun. Could they get another rocket num? Did they have time num? Could they? 6 seconds. He looked at Rachel, saw his horror reflected in her eyes, saw her reaching for Tommy's photograph, preparing to accept they'd tried and physics had betrayed them, and 7 seconds. The mountain hiccuped. Not an explosion. A tremor, like the earth clearing its throat. Cliff pushed himself up. The roof of Wolf's den lifted, just an inch, maybe 2, but it lifted. The pressure inside building faster than concrete could contain it. The roof floated for a fraction of a second, riding on superheated gas, hanging there like a magic trick. Then the ammunition magazine caught a spark. The world turned white. This wasn't an explosion. This was an excavation. Violent removal of matter and redistribution across a very large area in very short time. 600 pounds of Composition B, plus 2,400 rounds of 88mm ammunition, plus fuel, plus propellant. Total yield 8 tons of TNT equivalent. The shockwave was solid air compressed and angry, racing outward at the speed of physics. It hit the grisly broadside. 3 tons of steel anchored by 6-wheel drive and parking brake. None of it mattered. The shockwave picked the entire vehicle up and shoved it sideways 8 feet like a toy. Cliff buried his face in snow hands overhead, screaming silently as debris rained down. Concrete chunks the size of engine blocks. Twisted rebar. Shattered glass. A piece of concrete the size of a footlocker slammed into ground 3 feet from his head, embedding 6 inches deep. The 88mm barrel, 15 feet of precision, German steel, snapped at its mounting and tumbled over the cliff. Cliff watched it fall, embed itself nose first in granite below, pointing uselessly at ground. A monument to defeat. Physics, beaten by better physics. When dust settled, Cliff pushed himself to his knees. His whole body shook. Shock. Adrenaline. "Rachel!" he croaked. His voice sounded underwater. No response. "Rachel!" A pile of snow shifted. An arm emerged. Then Rachel's head helmet askew, face covered in soot and blood from split lip. She blinked, looked past him. Eyes went wide. "Cliff," she whispered. "Look." He turned. Wolf's den was gone. Not damaged. Gone. In its place was a smoking crater carved into mountainside 40 feet across, 15 feet deep. The fortress that held back Third Army for 6 weeks had been cracked open like an egg. Concrete chunks the size of automobiles scattered across slope. The observation slit was now jagged, opening into nothing. Smoke poured from crater, occasionally lit by secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off. The wolf was dead. Cliff stumbled to the grizzly. She was a wreck. Paint scorched off rear quarter. Launch rail twisted. Windshield shattered. But when he turned the key, that beautiful, ugly Dodge engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. "She's still breathing," Cliff said, patting hot metal. His voice broke. "She's still breathing, Rachel." Rachel climbed to her feet, unsteady, holding ribs. She limped over, and together they stared at what they'd accomplished. Suddenly, valley floor erupted in light. Not fire. Flares. Green flares. Dozens arcing into night sky from American lines. Blackburn had seen the explosion, understood immediately. The door was open. Radio crackled. Blackburn's voice distorted by static and emotion. "Grizzly 1, this is Bull 6. Confirm status. Over."
Rachel grabbed handset with shaking hand. "Bull 6, Grizzly 1. Wolf is dead. Gate is open. I say again, gate is open. Over." Pause. Then, Blackburn's voice sounding like a man who believed his soldiers might actually live. "Outstanding, Grizzly 1. Welcome to Valhalla. All units advance. I say again, advance." From their mountainside position, they watched Valley come alive. Headlights. Dozens. Then hundreds. Shermans. Trucks. Half-tracks. Jeeps. The entire Third Army supply column rolling forward like a river breaking through a dam. First Sherman passed through Valley, rolling past burning Panzer wreckage. The crew saw grizzlies silhouetted against burning crater. They waved. Rachel started to laugh, then cry, then both. "Tommy would have loved this," she said, voice thick.
He didn't miss it, Cliff said. He made it possible. His death taught us what not to do. Taught us that sometimes you build something that shouldn't exist. They stood watching the American advance, watching history bend around one mechanic's refusal to quit. Finally, Rachel looked at him. "We need to get down." "We're driving," Cliff said. "She got us up. She gets us home." The descent was slower, careful. Flat tire thumped with every rotation. Steering pulled left. Oil leaked. But she ran. They met advancing column at Snake Path Base. Soldiers erupted in cheers, seeing the Grizzly limp down scorched paint and twisted rail, telling the story better than words. Sergeant Vincent Kowalski was there. When Cliff stopped, Kowalski ran over and pulled him into a bear hug that drove air from his lungs. "I told you it was insane," Kowalski said, pulling back to look at Cliff's burned face. "I told you it would never work. I told you." He stopped, swallowed hard. "Thank God you didn't listen. Thank God you're crazier than I am sensible." Cliff grinned through split lips. "Still owe me 10 rounds, Sergeant. I owe you 100. Those boys marching up that valley, they're alive because you built something I said couldn't exist." He stepped back, saluted. Not casual. Real. The kind you give someone who's earned something rank alone can never buy. Respect. A medic checked them. Cliff's second-degree burns on hands and face, frostbite burst left eardrum. Rachel concussion, split lip, cracked rib. Minor. All minor. Blackburn was there, flask in hand. When they walked over, he handed it without words. Tennessee whiskey burned, going down, cut through blood and cordite taste. "Morrison. Hartley." Blackburn's voice was rough. "You just changed the war." "We changed one mountain, sir," Cliff said. "One mountain that was killing us. One fortress that was unbreakable." He looked at Grizzly. "Until a mechanic decided it wasn't." 3 months later, Army Corps of Engineers headquarters, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Captain Rachel Hartley, promoted 2 ranks in 3 months, stood before a classroom of young engineering officers. Behind her, projected on wall, was photograph of the Grizzly, scorched, twisted, beautiful in ugliness. "This," she said, tapping image, "is what happens when you stop asking, 'What does the manual say?' and start asking, 'What does physics allow?'" Students scribbled notes. Fresh lieutenants straight from engineering schools trained to follow specifications. "The Willys MB wasn't designed to carry 600 pounds. We put 1,200 on extended frame and drove up a mountain the manual said was impassable." She clicked to technical drawings, weight distributions, calculations. "We violated every regulation in the Army manual and saved 400 lives and broke a 6-week siege." A lieutenant raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you know when to follow rules and when to break them?" Rachel smiled. Tommy's smile. "You follow rules that serve the mission and soldiers. You break rules that serve only themselves." She walked to window. "My brother died following rules. A mechanic saved 400 men by breaking them. The difference was understanding which rules were written by people who'd solved the problem and which by people who'd never seen it." She turned back. "This course is field modifications and improvised engineering, but really it's about understanding your job isn't to follow the manual. Your job is to bring soldiers home, and sometimes the only way is to build something the manual says can't exist." After class, a corporal approached. "Package for you, ma'am. From Ohio." Inside was a photograph. Cliff and Lily beside a tractor, both covered in grease, both grinning. On back in handwriting that looked written with a wrench. She asked what I did in the war. "I told her I fixed things with a brilliant engineer who taught me the best solutions come from people who refuse to accept impossible. Thank you for building the Grizzly with me. The wrench remembers. Cliff. P.S. Lily wants to be an engineer. I told her she should. I told her about you." Rachel folded the letter carefully, put it in jacket pocket next to Tommy's photograph she still carried. On her office wall, next to her Berkeley degree, hung a piece of scorched metal, fragment of Grizzly's hood. On it, a plaque. "Sometimes you have to build the impossible to achieve the necessary. The Grizzly Protocol, 1944. She touched it gently. "We did it, Tommy. We changed the rules." 40 years later. Morrison Family Farm, Ohio. Summer, 1984. The barn smelled like oil and cut grass and old machinery being coaxed back to life. Clifton Merrick, 72 hands gnarled but steady, was teaching grandson Tyler to rebuild a tractor engine. "This here's the crankshaft," Cliff explained, pointing with wrench. "Heart of the engine. Gets damaged, nothing works. But see these grooves? This wear, that surface. We can polish it. Get another 5 years. Tyler, 8 years old, nodded seriously. "Grandpa, My teacher says you were in the war. Did you shoot anybody? Cliff paused, wrench in hand. No, son. I didn't shoot anybody. I fixed things. Fixed them so other people could come home. That doesn't sound very exciting. Cliff walked to barn wall. There, in simple frame, was a photograph. Black and white, faded. Two people beside something that looked like a jeep, but wasn't. Both covered in soot and mud. Both grinning. Exciting is for movies, Tyler. Important is for life. He touched the frame. I carried a wrench, not a rifle. But that wrench saved 400 boys from an assault they wouldn't survive. Sometimes the most important thing is solving a problem everyone says can't be solved. Just with a wrench, with stubbornness, with refusing to accept impossible, with understanding that people telling you something can't be done usually haven't tried hard enough. He pulled his wallet. Inside, protected by yellowed plastic, was Lily's drawing. Crayon faded over 4 decades, but yellow sun still visible. Your grandmother drew this for me when the world was dark and cold and scary. When I was on a mountain in Belgium, freezing terrified, convinced I'd die. She drew sunshine, reminded me what I was fighting to get back to. Tyler held the drawing carefully, understanding this fragile paper was more valuable than anything in the barn. Did you get scared, Grandpa, on the mountain? Cliff was quiet, then knelt eye level with his grandson, arthritic knees protesting. I was terrified, Tyler. Every single second. My hands shook so hard I could barely hold the wrench. I thought about running, about giving up, about all the ways I could fail and never see this farm again. Never see your grandmother's face. Never teach you to fix tractors on summer days like this. But you didn't run. No, because your grandmother drew me a son, and I promised to come home, and mechanics keep their promises. He touched Tyler's chest over his heart. The bravery isn't in not being scared, son. The bravery is in picking up the wrench anyway, in doing the work even when your hands shake, in solving the problem even when everyone says it can't be solved. Tyler nodded seriously, receiving wisdom he wouldn't fully understand for years, but would carry forever. Cliff stood looking out at Ohio summer sunshine. Real sunshine, not crayon sunshine. The sunshine he'd promised to come home to 40 years ago. That's all any of us can do, he said softly. Remember the promise. Do the work. Pass it down. He picked up his wrench, handed it to Tyler. Now, let's fix this tractor. Together. One bolt at a time. The way things are supposed to be done. And in golden afternoon light of peaceful Ohio summer, an old mechanic and young boy bent over an engine continuing a legacy that started on a frozen mountain with a yellow crayon sun and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The wrench turned. The bolt loosened. The work continued. Just as it always had. Just as it always would. One bolt at a time. And he'd smile. Not the smile of someone who craved glory or recognition. The smile of someone who knew deep in his bones that he'd done something that mattered. That he'd kept his promise to a 5-year-old girl with a crayon and a dream of sunshine. That he'd been the man she thought he was. And in the end, isn't that what legacy really means? Not statues or medals or names in history books, but the quiet knowledge that when it mattered most, when physics and fear and impossible odds stood in the way, you picked up your wrench and got to work. You built something that shouldn't exist. You solved the problem everyone said couldn't be solved. You came home. The yellow sun still shines in Cliff's wallet, faded, but visible, a promise kept in crayon and steel. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any war isn't the biggest gun or the heaviest armor. Sometimes it's just a stubborn mechanic who doesn't know how to quit. And a wrench, always a wrench,